In 1901, Carnegie Steel was at its peak. It dominated the steel industry and was one of the most valuable companies in the country. But despite it netting $40 million a year, Carnegie was ready to retire and wanted to sell his company. But who could buy it? That's where John came in. He basically told Carnegie to name his price, and he did. $480 million, which would be more than any other business deal in history. And yet, John agreed on the spot, and later confessed he would have paid $100 million more. John made the landmark purchase in 1901, but this was just the beginning of his ambitious plan. He merged Carnegie Steel with the Federal Steel Company and a few other businesses to form US Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, which had a market cap of $1.4 billion. Just to put that in perspective, all the manufacturing in the country was capitalized at a combined $9 billion. This deal gave John control over roughly 2/3 of the American steel production. So basically, two of the largest industries at the time were steel and railroads, and John had seemingly conquered both. And he didn't stop there. John helped finance Thomas Edison's early experiments with electricity. He then played an important role in merging Edison Electric with its competitors in order to create General Electric. And John was also influential in creating what would later become AT&T. John's talents for combining companies together and turning them into unstoppable giants was unmatched. But unfortunately, a crisis was about to begin. In 1893, the United States was facing a depression the likes of which it had never seen before. After several decades of continued growth and unchecked investments, the bubble burst, and the American economy was plunged into chaos. Stocks plummeted, losing almost half their value, thousands of businesses closed their doors forever, hundreds of banks went bankrupt, and unemployment rates skyrocketed throughout the country. The crisis scared off foreign investors, who cashed in their American bonds in exchange for gold, slowly but surely depleting the US reserves. Since at the time, the dollar was still tied to the gold standard, meaning anyone could convert their paper money into physical gold, and thus had more confidence their paper money was actually worth something. As a result, the American government always kept at least $100 million worth of gold bullion on hand to back the dollar. But by 1895, most of that gold was gone, and the dollar's value was in a sharp decline. At its lowest, the government had no more than $9 million worth of gold reserves, which meant that it was in danger of defaulting on its loans at any moment. And of course, this run on gold just spread more panic, having a domino effect where more investors pulled their money out of the US and depleted the reserves even further. The US didn't have a central bank at the time to rescue them, and the situation was extremely dire. President Cleveland understood this was a crossroads moment for America that would forever alter its course. The traditional strategy of simply selling more bonds to the American people wouldn't work fast enough. John knew this was the time for drastic and immediate action, so he traveled to Washington to meet the president and lay out his game plan in order to bring America back from the brink of an economic disaster. John's audacious scheme was to form a private syndicate consisting of the most prominent bankers in the country, who would work together with foreign investors to shore up America's gold reserves. His syndicate offered to purchase $65 million worth of 30-year gold bonds using 3.5 million ounces of gold. Thanks to an old Civil War statute, President Cleveland could agree to the deal right then and there without having to wait for approval from Congress. Once Cleveland signed the agreement, John wired his men in New York and told them to act, and in only 22 minutes, they bought out all the gold bonds. John's decisive actions had an immediate calming effect on the volatile financial market and restored faith in the economy. John had almost single-handedly saved them from total collapse. And of course, being the shrewd businessman that he was, he had also made a large profit from the enterprise by securing generous rates on the gold bonds that he purchased. And thus, whilst John had saved the day and helped bail out the government, it also raised concerns. It illustrated the vast influence and power of one single banker on the entire US economy, and some asked whether his motivations were really patriotic or simply opportunistic to line his own pockets. At the next election, the relationship between big banks and the government was a hot topic for the Democrats. But John and his banker friends donated heavily to the Republican nominee who won the election instead. So for now, John kept his close ties to the government. But this was not the only time that John was instrumental in stabilizing the American economy. In 1907, the country was facing another deepening financial crisis, which led to several banks being on the verge of bankruptcy, leading to hordes of people queuing up around the block to withdraw their money from their bank accounts. The government government reportedly had to tell bank tellers to deliberately count the money slower to try and reduce the rate cash was being withdrawn, because if everyone pulled their money out at the same time, it could be catastrophic. By this point, Roosevelt was the president, and as we already know, he certainly did not see eye to eye with John on most things. But the crisis of 1907 was so dire that they both agreed it would be in America's best interest if the government and big business worked together to save the country from falling into a depression. So Roosevelt called on JPMorgan to salvage the situation. Once again, John's strategy was to spend a lot of money where it was needed most. He summoned dozens of the leading financiers and leaders of the nation's biggest banks and trusts to join him in his private library on Madison Avenue and decide on the best course of action. John's plan was essentially for them to invest in their smaller competitors. John concluded that although some banks would inevitably fail, others could still be saved. So he and his associates deposited giant sums of money in a number of banks so that they would be able to pay their depositors and avoid declaring bankruptcy. After revealing his plan, John then locked the door while the bankers negotiated amongst themselves, literally locking them in until they agreed on a resolution. By the morning, everyone had agreed with John's plan, and with Roosevelt's approval, the US Treasury also contributed $25 million, showing the level of trust and respect the president had for John's business sense. What's remarkable is that John was 70 years old at this point and negotiated all of this whilst having a terrible cold, meaning he was constantly coughing and sneezing while saving the US economy. But his plan ultimately worked. Lots of capital was injected back into the economy, public confidence was restored in America's banking system, and yet another economic disaster was averted thanks to John's wheelings and dealings. But whilst he was once again briefly labelled as a hero, almost immediately people began to realise just how dependent they had become on one single man. Something needed to change. Now, so far we've heard how JPMorgan revolutionized the railroads, which changed the way people transported goods. But what about right now? With so many different shipping services available these days, how do you know where to get the best deal? That's where our video sponsor, ShipStation, comes in. They make it easy to compare prices and delivery times from different carriers, and even help you get huge discounts, like up to 84% off USPS and UPS rates. Normally, it's only the big companies that can benefit from economies of scale like this, but thanks to ShipStation, e-commerce businesses of any size can get the best shipping deals too. Plus, ShipStation saves you so much time. It effortlessly integrates everywhere you sell online, including Amazon, Etsy, eBay, Shopify, and more. That way, you can manage every order from one simple dashboard, as well as automate routine shipping tasks and print shipping labels. And as if that wasn't enough, if you use my link below, you'll get 2 months completely free. So keep growing your business all year long with ShipStation. Go to shipstation.com/magnates today and sign up for your free 60-day trial. That's shipstation.com/magnates. John was facing increased scrutiny. The age of the robber baron who could conduct his business unchecked and unimpeded was slowly coming to an end, as the American public was growing increasingly wary of a handful of businessmen wielding so much power and influence. John was summoned to testify before the Pujo Committee that wanted to investigate the true reach of Wall Street's money trust and its role in the American economy. John was front and center during the Pujo Committee hearings, and he became the face of Wall Street power. Despite his financial success, John's mental state was deteriorating. He had multiple nervous breakdowns, and he struggled to deal with the public's negative portrayal of him in the media. Ironically, he was actually due to board the Titanic for its maiden voyage, but due to health issues, pulled out at the last moment. Meanwhile, the Pujo Committee paved the way for the establishment of the Federal Reserve, since it was clear they couldn't just rely on a handful of ultra-rich and powerful individuals to step in and fix the economy. But John would never see the repercussions of this investigation, because months later, on March 31st, 1913, the 75-year-old financier died while on vacation in Rome. After his death, John's son took over the business and continued its expansion. In fact, even in present day, there are still concerns the bank is too powerful. It's undergone countless acquisitions and mergers over the year, something John himself would have been proud of, like mergers with Bank One, Best Earns, and most notably of all in the year 2000, the merger with Chase Bank to create JPMorgan Chase. With an estimated $3 trillion in assets, after 200 years of consolidation in the banking industry, JPMorgan Chase is the biggest bank in the world by market capitalization. And so, whilst opinion will be divided on John Pierpont Morgan, there's no doubt his legacy lives on. But personally, when it comes to the era of these industrialists, my favorite story is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Honestly, there was nobody quite like him. And so if you don't